So let it be written. So let it be done. This is Tabletop Terrors, and today I want to tell you about the way that my eyes were opened by a video that Jeff showed me that showed James and I, that completely changed the way that I'm going to approach game design moving forward. I'm going to add this tool to my tool belt, but Jeff, tell me about this video. Tell everybody watching what this video's whole deal is.
Yeah, so it's a video that I found on YouTube by a great YouTube channel called Game Maker's Toolkit. It's basically a guy who talks about video game design, a whole bunch of different angles about down to like specific level design to like just general design principles and stuff like that. But I found a video on his channel that really kind of got me thinking and that I wanted to share with these other guys and talk about, which is called The Games That Designed Themselves, which is a very, yeah, evocative title. And the basic premise of the video is kind of going through a couple famous games where the games that the designers sort of set out to make and the games that ended up being made by those people ended up being very, very different because the game kind of showed them a different way that it wanted to be, which is kind of a weird, fuzzy way to talk about it. Basically, you're working on a game, you've got this idea for what you want it to be, and then you make a mechanic for that game, and then you make all the other mechanics, and then you suddenly find out that like that one mechanic that you made is actually the most fun part of the game, even though in your head it was just a little part of a bigger system. Now suddenly you're realizing like, oh, this is the game. Like this is what the game should just be about instead of all this other stuff that I was trying to jam in there. Even though this isn't what I set out to make, this is better, basically. And he gave a whole bunch of examples of like famous video games. One of the ones that I found most interesting was the indie game Crypt the Necrodancer, which if you haven't heard of, it's like a roguelike dungeon crawler, uh, turn-based game, except the big sort of hook of the game is that it's set to music. Like it's a rhythm game, roguelike dungeon crawler, essentially, which is a very strange combo of things. But what was really interesting that the video sort of talked about was that the guy who made Crypt of the Necrodancer did not set out to make a rhythm game. Like the whole set to music thing, which is the core of Crypt of the Necrodancer, the entire thing that like sets it apart as its own game, was not even the original idea for the game. He'd wanted to make like a roguelike game, kind of like Spelunky, these sorts of like super fast paced dungeon crawling, roguelikes where you die a lot and get sent back to the start. But he wanted to make it like turn based, like a traditional RPG. But he wanted to keep that sort of fast pace of those games. So he added in turn timers. So you had 1 second to make your move, like really quick pace. And then found out basically just by playtesting this like fast paced turn system that like, oh, just because of the turn timers and how short they are, I find myself kind of falling into like a rhythm almost when I'm playing these games. And then like after all of that, the idea struck of like, oh, I could just put like it's already a rhythmic game. I could just put it to music and focus on that. Um, and thus this crazy new idea was born and it ended up becoming the sort of indie hit that it was. So it's really interesting how design can unfold in that way where it almost leaves your own hands at some point and sort of guides you to be what it should be as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to the other way around, which is not usually how we think of design. So yeah, it's a really cool video. I'd highly recommend it, and I think we're just gonna dive into our sort of own experiences with this and how we look at it.
I have never even considered starting a game, starting to design a game without having some idea of the lore and the tone. And so even the concept of going in and saying, let's put some mechanics together and make a fun little engine and then theme it is like, oh, that's so intriguing to me. Like I want to do that. I'm full naming you guys. Hold on, let me change this here. Sorry.
I I wanted to. I love some of the things you said there, Jeff. Especially that you talked about how the design almost guides you. Um, and the way I see that is that it's like once you have some sort of foundation, something to work from, you can tweak different parts of it, even parts that you maybe made at the beginning. Like you said, Tim, once it's almost an engine, a thing you can play. Um, then from there, I don't know. You don't know what will happen at that point. That's when you're really getting started. I wanted to read something from an essay I posted actually on our Patreon because what I think is cool is that Jeff, you mentioned, oh, I think it's very interesting how they had no idea that they would set out to make it, and the essay was all about trying to separate your ideas from what you think their implementation is or might be,
Hmm.
because not that you can't say, oh, I might like to use this here, or, this is going to be, or have some idea, but just to be that flexible. Because to put it another way, if the creator of Crypt of the Necrodancer wasn't as flexible, they would have never made the very, unique, really cool game. Um, so I wrote this part. So obviously it's written, so it's going to come across a little more flowery than my normal speech. But as you iterate, you'll eventually find places to use more of your ideas. Some may sit for a long time, but you'll always have just the peanut butter for whatever creative jam you find yourself in. Continue recording and developing your ideas and watch them mature. It's not a bad thing to come back and find a little dust on the bottle. I've had what I thought were brand new ideas that turned out to be the unconscious evolutions of years old brainstorms. This meant coming across whole swaths of finished text I had just been meaning to get started on. There it was, written and formatted as if plucked from my daydreams by unseen gnomes. I literally like wrote some notes one night and then went and was like, oh, I have this idea for a game, and I wrote some notes out and everything. And then I looked and I thought, well, those are the parts I still need to write for this game. I just need, and it was just like, well, not worrying about it just allowed me to go, oh, here we go. And now I wrote them together, and I still don't know what that will become. So, yeah, it's really cool that there's a whole video about the lives of games that way, because it's easy to be afraid that until you publish a game that, well, maybe this is a poor method of doing it, So
Yeah,
that's
I
really
mean,
cool.
it sort of it plays in it sort of dismantles a trope in my favorite sort of way, which is like the mad genius creative who just like has a brilliant idea and
Yeah.
follows the seamless one path from idea to finished product, where it's just like it's easy to imagine other people who make really cool things as like, wow, they just invented this singular idea and just followed the path to its completion, and here it is. But that's just almost never how it works out. Like ideas change and
Yeah.
things don't work, and you iterate and you try again, and then you mash this together with that, and then suddenly at the end, you have what to you is this patchwork amalgamation of 80,000 things, as you've changed your mind and scrapped and started over and rehashed and done this and done that. But to everyone else, they just see this finished, cohesive thing. So yeah, I think it's very important to sort of realize that if you're designing this way, where you come up with an idea, you follow it to wherever it goes, and then it doesn't work, but you take this part that you liked and then you mesh it in with that. Like, you're not a fraud if you make things that way. Like, that's just how people make things. Like, you don't see the process all the time, but it's just the creative process. And never be afraid to iterate, and redo and just play test and see where things go, and you might find your project radically becoming a radically different thing than where you started, and sometimes that might be exactly what the project needs to like be what you want it to be, which is again weird to think that like you might have an idea for a project and you might come up with a way to execute that, and then amidst the process it becomes something completely different, and somehow that's the best thing that possibly could have happened to it. And like you set out to make, you know this fantasy adventure, system, and then suddenly you've come up with this like awesome like crafting and like archaeology system, like where you can scavenge artifacts and resources, and suddenly like half your system is like scavenging artifacts in your like fantasy world, and it's like, wait, what if my system's just an archaeology game. Like, what if that's the game where you
Yeah.
find and you dig up these artifacts? Because I have this whole system that I love. It's awesome. And all the other stuff that I'm trying to do is sort of just detracting from this cool thing that I found. So what if I just don't do all of that stuff and just lean fully into this weird part of this bigger picture that's now suddenly its own whole picture?
Yeah, and I feel like the thing that this also reinforces is that you can't playtest an idea and that you need to just write down what you think you want to do, even if it's very sweeping and broad. You know, we can fall into the trap of going in and starting to write the rules document from the beginning as though someone was going to read it. And instead, it's okay to open up a document and say, turns work like this? Question mark. Maybe it alternates. Great. And then move on to the next thing and then have this very rough, very sort of playable thing and then go, all right, let's give it a shot. And it just gives me the freedom to do that more often. I until I watched this video, I didn't realize that this was a sort of dry concrete place in my creative process where I think I need to have rules finished before someone can playtest them. And that's a terrible idea. Because I couldn't have, well, it's a harder thing to break up all the things I just wrote to go back to make it a dancing game because I've already gotten so far in my roguelike. So I can also, it's harder commitment. You know, I put in all this time and effort. So
Yeah.
if I don't let people in early enough, maybe we miss out on the dancing game. Well, the rhythmic-based roguelite. It's not a dancing game.
Yeah. No, that's how you end up with just giant chunks, just hours and hours of stuff that you spent just so much time and energy on that aren't good, which is like a very blunt way to say it, but like
Yeah.
it's if you try to complete the entire thing and then put it out into the world, there's gonna be so much that doesn't work right the first time. Like no one gets all these things right on the first go. Where it's
That's
just
so
like, all
true.
right, I've written the entire book start to finish. No one has seen it yet. I put it out, and everyone loves it and thinks it's perfect. Like that's just not what's gonna happen. And the more time you go without this iteration and testing process, the more likely you have huge chunks of the project that you'll need to completely redo or start over or even just get rid of entirely, which is not only uh, extremely frustrating in terms of your time and energy, it can also just be difficult emotionally to like have spent so much time on this creative nugget just to then be like, oh, wait, this thing that I've been
Oh,
working
man.
on and working on and working on isn't fun to play. Like, I gotta get rid of it. Like, and it can be a difficult emotional situation. So the more you can just rough things out and get them out and just see how they go, and then build from there, you have a lot better chance of getting somewhere good. I don't remember enough of the specifics, so I'm gonna mess up the story in like the specific details, but the general principle will go. It wasn't in the video that sort of started this whole conversation, but it was in a different design thing that I was watching not too long ago, where someone was basically asking for advice of like, I want to make a game. I have these ideas. Like, how do you even get from here to making any progress? And it was basically an amateur game designer talking to a professional game designer, and the advice from the pro was basically like, set yourself like a very strict time limit and do what they called a MVP, which is minimum viable product. Like get the smallest possible functioning working system that you can get. Whether that's if you're making a platforming game, make 2 levels, but they function. You can move a character and you can
Mhm.
get from start to finish. Uh, and then just whatever you have to do to make this thing function, that's all you care about. Don't worry about art. Don't worry about music. Like there was a game jam where someone basically made I don't remember the game. It's like a very popular indie game that started in a game jam, and in the game jam, the player character that moved around was just Link from Link to the Past. They just took the sprite sheet from Link from Zelda and made that the character. Is like, I don't have time to like to do pixel art to make this character or to like find out. I just need a person that moves on the screen. So I'm just gonna take the Zelda sprite sheet. I'm just gonna jam that in, and like that'll let me focus on the mechanics of the game rather than, you know, getting hung up on all these details that I'll be able to polish later. I can't polish those into a good game if this gameplay is not good. So I'm gonna start there and work from there, which I thought was a fascinating way to go through it, of just like all these things that we normally love to tinker with on the beginning of a project, like, are not the things that will make the project successful. Like, what's going to make it successful is trying it out, refining it, trying it out, refining it. Like, that is the core of design, and everything else is just stuff that'll make the final project more coherent and more tonally cool and more interesting and all that. But that is not where you need to be spending a lot of time early on. Like, just hack together whatever you possibly can, ship it out to whoever you can convince to try it, see what they say, and do that on repeat, basically.
Yeah, I like the idea, actually. Tim, you mentioned potentially getting caught up at the beginning, writing the rules out and everything. I like the idea more than ever now of inviting people to play a game and explaining to them what they need to know, but not explaining to them the rules. Because what I have in my head is not what I have necessarily been able to wrangle into an explanation until I can explain it to somebody and realize what I can't explain, you know? And so it's almost better because it also is a different experience. I'm excited to play test a game I've been working on soon here, but that was one of the biggest hurdles I faced, is I realized that making the game something that is effectively an improv game, the goal is to not break character, right? It's a function of the game now, because that was the problem I needed to solve. Well, I don't want players to have a chance to think about it too much, for example, you know? But basically the idea is that without even writing the concept or considering what it would look like, you know, even before bringing it to somebody. But the idea is, when I do bring it, it's going to be fun to see how it works. And because I know all the rules, I'll understand what the design, you know, implications of that might be, if that makes sense. So yeah, I like that idea of like, no, you have to get it in front of people, because the moment you start trying to explain a rule sometimes is the moment you realize what's wrong with it.
Yeah, I mean, you're describing exactly why I haven't released several things that I know I have ideas for, is that, like you say, instead of sitting down and trying to play it, I have to try to write it out. And it's really, I mean, you can use a lot of different analogies, but it's like scoring sheet music before, it's like filling out sheet music before you know what the song is going to be. Like, you can do it. It's just hard. And it's like, Jeff, you made a really good point, and you totally added me, bro, with like, how many versions of the 5-minute RPG are there where there are these chunks and chunks, these paragraphs of these rules that I don't even know anymore, because I had the desire to jump in and do that, you know? Real quick, before I forget to mention it too, James, I don't know what format these need to exist in, but when you read that part of your essay, I totally want audio of those essays. Like, even if we do it on a video and it's just a background.
The plan is to read them just to get a wider audience, you know, because the moment I say essay, I can feel the digital audience shrinking back. I can feel losing them, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yes, hopefully a spoken thing. I think that'd be really cool. So yeah, I think that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Another story, I wanted to say this earlier and it didn't fit as well, but another story I wanted to bring up that wasn't necessarily the game creating itself, but was when they were making Diablo. And the creator of Diablo had a turn-based game in mind. And production kept saying, hey, but will you try a real-time? And he just said no. He was staunch against it. No. And then when he finally tried it, it was so obvious that that's what it had to be. And it was the same where, like, well, you just, in my opinion, you simply have to be open to whatever it might be, because you don't know. You know what I mean? You some people think they're an expert on their ideas, but Sometimes letting go of that little bit is the thing that it needs.
Yeah, and just the core of what makes an idea cool and like all the trappings you've put onto it are not always the same thing. Like sometimes they are, and like this very specific idea like needs to be done exactly how you imagined it for it to feel right. But most of the time, like what makes something fun or interesting is not always like the thing that you've set out to make, and like realizing that can be difficult but very rewarding. Like there's a bunch of other examples in the video that were just like someone started this game as like a stealth game that like happened to have like a pushing and pulling mechanic where you could like grab people and push them into walls or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And you were supposed to be like a secret agent who was, splinter selling their way through these levels and doing all this sort of and doing that sort of thing. But then they just like found out that like everyone who played the game like were just like pushing and just throwing guards into the walls and just basically just running around and doing that. And it's just like this thing that I threw in as like an offhand side mechanic. Everyone who tests this is just doing that. So like that's the game now. No more stealth, no more secret agents, and it became this game where basically you're like this giant like gorilla person who's just like rampaging through a science. I don't remember the specifics, but it's like completely different tonally from like what the person sort of set out to make. But like the heart of what was the interesting gameplay is what has persisted and like has what is what basically made the project like successful. So it reminds me, this is a tiny bit vulgar. I'll cut out like the bad language specifically, but I remember watching it was Dan Harmon, maker of Community, Rick and Morty, a bunch of stuff like that, talking about just like the parts of your like basically what the parts that you as the conscious creator think are the cool things versus what everyone else thinks are the cool things. Because like he was on a YouTube show. Basically, they were playing video games and talking just about whatever, but they kind of got into a little chat about design where like Dan Harmon basically got asked like this character in Rick and Morty, like, oh God, what's his name? It's like
Bird
Mr.
person?
Poopy Butthole or something like that.
Oh.
Like,
Oh, that is his name. Yep.
Yeah.
That's his name.
You nailed it.
it was just like, how could you have possibly predicted that when you set out to make this show that there would be like merch of that character, that like that's the person who's like somehow like famous in all of this. And I remember seeing Dan Harmon basically just say like, yeah, it just really goes to show you that like the person, like the part of your brain that like makes decisions and conscious choices is not the part of your brain that's paying the bills when it comes to like this creative stuff. Like it's sometimes just the weirdest little side things that like flourish into these huge, phenomenons. Just the design process is weird, and it's okay to just let it be weird sometimes.
Yeah, and I think so on the heels of letting it be weird, I also want to say you want things to be broken. And here's what I mean. There were more examples in that video where the creators had a mechanic in place because, oh, you're supposed to, in Rocket League, you need this thing to do this. Well, when they implemented it, it also allowed people to move while they were in the air. And similar, they had a couple of different examples like this where the Devil May Cry fighting mechanic, where you were able to juggle enemies. There was this glitch where when you hit an enemy with a sword, it like basically juggles them, which again became the main thrust of Devil May Cry's combos. And so these things, if they waited until they were perfect and then implemented them, you wouldn't have some of the most famous mechanics also. So there's also an element of playtest it so that you have your weird pushing and pulling and you're like, wow, everyone just wants to push and pull in this game. Or everyone's gravitating toward this, Jeff used the archaeology example. I keep setting up all this other cool stuff and everyone just takes their turn to go to the pit and dig in it. And then you find you have this archaeology game. Take that a step further. Don't wait until you have a finished archaeology game. Just put some stuff in there and then you go, oh, that's a weird break. I like that. It's weird that you can take cards from another player the way the rules are written. That's fun. Let's leave it in. So, and I'm talking directly to myself here. Like, I need to be okay with, yeah, it's broken. Like, great. Let's see what parts of that broken thing might be cooler than if we made it perfect, you know?
Yeah, there's so many things in games that you think were brilliant strokes of genius, or like awesome plot twists in a movie or a book that were like totally surprising, uh, that you think this person like handcrafted. Half of those were probably complete accidents. Like they didn't even mean to do that, and just like by the nature of sort of what they made, like these things emerged basically. Like the example that Tim said in the video is like the boost in Rocket League, which is like the entire like style of Rocket League is based around like, yeah, you can like fly up the walls and boost through the air and hit the ball and stuff like that. Um, that was an accident. They didn't mean for that to be possible. It just like the way that they programmed in the boost like didn't account, basically like it was just the physics engine just pushed the car basically from the back, which on the ground has the effect of boosting. Uh, but in the air, basically still allowed you to do all the same things because it was programmed wrong, in air quotes. And suddenly the defining feature of the game has been born. Like it's silly.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, it emerges from there, and I think that's what we talked about earlier was you have to find yourself in a situation where you're trying to solve the problem of boost to find that, which, as you pointed out, means you just have to get started and play test it. It's like that's the most important thing, because if it's bad, you'll know soon. So don't worry about it being bad. It's a good thing if they go, this doesn't play. Okay, make it play.
Yeah, I also think too that there's a there's a specific game that I'm working on, and I have not prototyped it. The only reason why I haven't prototyped it is because I wanted to try to figure out the exact probabilities of certain cards. So there's a mechanic where you have to put two cards together. James, you played a very early version of this. And then those two cards, the way you put them together dictates what you can do. And I wanted to make sure that everything was fairly represented. And I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm literally going to just make random cards that I just feel like and just draw these symbols and just be like, eh. And what a liberating thing. Because I was so concerned about probability and fairness and balance and poop on all that.
I underestimated
balance
games
what?
before.
What's there to balance if nothing exists?
Right.
Like,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
In the board game Power Grid, I was like really fascinated with how they designed the different values for how expensive it was to build places. And then I had my mind blown when I read in an interview, they're like, oh, well, it maps to real world. Like if there's a lot of terrain there, a lot of mountains, it's more expensive. If it's not. So it was like, well, it's kind of and I was just like, well, they just picked anything. You know what I mean? It
Yeah.
opened me up to that to go, oh, well, they chose something and it created an economy. And because we play within that, that changes the game. It didn't matter. There's not some math behind it of this has to be. No, it's just, well, it's kind of real and that worked, Some are more expensive, some are cheaper. Some people go this way, that way. And that tends to match real life. You go to the cheap ones first and the more expensive ones later,
That's fantastic. Yeah. So if you're watching this, it's time to start playing your game. And if you have at least a half-cocked idea in your head, to explain it to another person, and they're willing to play it, try it. And when you
and I think we're getting more used to this, and maybe this isn't a good time to mention it, but I think it's the better time than ever. Or if that's your story, or if that's your movie, or if that's your script, right? It's a little different with a game because the feedback's a little different, but
Sure.
You should start telling people about your story and they'll go, well, why would that character do that? That's feedback. Don't say no because this. Go instead.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Let me see. So including that as well to say, no, if you're writing something, get that out there, because the moment people start poking holes in it, they're engaging with you and your, object thing, whatever project is getting better.
Yeah. And just real quick to say, if you are doing another creative project, the version of like playing the game without the rules written is when you hit a point in your story that you don't know, in brackets, put the word reasons. I've started doing this because I would think that I had to make up on the fly the reasons. And then people would ignore what I was really trying to communicate and poke holes in the thin reason I literally improvised
Mm-hmm.
So instead I would say, well, so this character, they're in a lot of trouble financially for reasons. And that's it. That's all you need for then, because you want to get to this next part. I used to stop and go, well, because they, maybe they, and I would just go in a circle to try to make the reason right then. So, yeah, reasons, bracket reasons.
And a lot of wasted effort, especially. So,
totally, because it doesn't matter then. It could matter later. And yeah, you never know when you're going to make your crazy Rick and Morty character off the cuff. So, awesome. Well, if you like these kinds of videos, then you like Tabletop Terror. Surprise. We're all about fun, creativity, productivity. We do have a Patreon if you're interested in going over there and checking things out, revamping everything right now. But if nothing else, thank you for watching. It's been a lot of fun. And I'd love to hear in the comments any of these stories that you've heard. Like what started as one thing ended up as another, or things that, as Jeff calls them, these strokes of geniuses that were accidents. I'm sure we're only naming a couple of a million. So that would be great comments, or anything else you want to say. And in the meantime, I guess let's do ourselves a Tabtarian toast.
May you mend the first break.
May you kill the first snake.
May you conquer everything you undertake.
Sláinte.
Sláinte.
Stop that.